Jake Peters wasn't the type to believe in ghost stories or tall tales. A lifelong outdoorsman, he'd spent years hunting, fishing, and exploring the remote corners of the Arkansas wilderness. He knew the Ozarks better than anyone. Every ridge, every stream, every hidden hollow. But even Jake had heard the stories. The locals called it the Ozark Howler, a creature so steeped in legend that it was hard to separate fact from fiction. The descriptions varied. Some said it was a massive black cat with glowing red eyes. Others claimed it was a bear-like beast with horns and a howl that could freeze your blood. Jake had always dismissed the tales as folklore, the kind of stories old-timers told around the campfire to spook the younger generation. But one late autumn evening, deep in the heart of the Ozarks, he found himself questioning everything he thought he knew. Jake had taken a few days off work to clear his head and enjoy the last of the hunting season. He'd set up camp in his favorite part of the Ozark National Forest, miles from the nearest town, where the only sounds were the wind and the animals. It was peaceful, the kind of solitude Jake craved after weeks of dealing with the stresses of everyday life. On the second night, as the sun was setting and the forest grew dark, Jake settled by the fire with a cup of coffee, listening to the crackling of the flames. The air was crisp, and a thick fog had begun to roll in, blanketing the forest in a ghostly white. The firelight danced in the mist, creating strange shapes and shadows, and he relaxed while watching them and picking out things they looked like. Dog, bear, leaf. Jake had just started to totally relax when he heard it, a low, mournful howl echoing through the trees. It was distant at first, almost like the wail of a wolf, but deeper, more resonant. The sound seemed to carry on the wind, and he couldn't determine where it was coming from. He sat up, listening intently, his hand instinctively reaching for his mace. The howl came again, closer this time, and Jake felt his body tense up and react. He'd spent enough time in the wilderness to know the sounds of the forest, but this was something unnatural. The sound wasn't just loud, it was piercing, a bone-chilling wail that seemed really wrong. Jake grabbed his flashlight and shone it into the fog, but the beam was swallowed by the mist, barely reaching a few feet in front of him. The trees loomed like dark giants in the night, their branches creaking in the wind. For a moment, he thought he saw movement, a shadow darting between the trunks, but it was gone before he could focus on it. His mind raced through the possibilities. A cougar? A bear? But the howl was unlike anything he'd ever heard from any animal, and now he was sure it was coming closer, echoing off the trees, disorienting him. Jake decided it was time to move. He felt weird getting this nervous, but something about the howl had him on edge. He quickly packed up his gear, doused the fire, and headed out. He needed to get back to his truck, a few miles hike through the woods. Normally, the distance wouldn't have bothered him, but tonight, with the fog thickening and the howls growing louder, it felt like an eternity. He started down the trail, moving quickly but cautiously, his senses on high alert. The fog clung to him, making it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. The forest was eerily quiet, the usual night sounds of crickets and frogs replaced by an oppressive silence. The howls continued, each one louder than the last, until it felt like the creature was right on top of him. Jake quickened his pace. He could feel it now. Something was out there, something big, and he knew it was tracking him. Then, without warning, the howls stopped. The sudden silence was almost worse, the absence of sound making Jake's nerves jump. He slowed down, straining to listen, but there was nothing, just the sound of him walking slowly through the leaves. That's when he saw it. Through the fog, about 50 yards ahead, a dark shape moved between the trees. It was large, much larger than any animal he'd ever encountered in these woods. Jake froze, raising his flashlight, but it barely showed anything. He could just make out the outline of a hulking figure, covered in dark fur, slinking behind the trees. His held his breath as the creature turned towards him, revealing two glowing red eyes that pierced the darkness. They were intense, almost otherworldly, and filled with a cold, predatory intelligence. The creature let out a low growl, a deep rumble that vibrated through the ground, and he knew that's what he had been hearing. Jake's survival instincts kicked in. He backed away slowly, keeping the flashlight trained on the creature, but it didn't stop. It advanced slowly, deliberately, its eyes locked on him, its massive form barely visible through the fog. The stories flashed through his mind. Was this the Ozark Howler? The creature that had haunted these woods for generations? Without waiting to find out, Jake turned and ran. He sprinted down the trail, branches whipping against his face, the fog closing in around him. He could hear the creature behind him, its footsteps heavy, crashing through the underbrush. It was fast, faster than anything that big should be, and it was gaining on him. Jake pushed himself harder, his lungs burning, his legs aching, but the sound of the creature was right behind him, so close he could feel the vibrations of its footsteps through the ground. He glanced back, and for a moment he saw it, those red eyes closer than ever, and the dark, hulking shape of the beast almost on top of him. His truck was just ahead, parked at the edge of the forest. With a final burst of speed, Jake reached it, throwing himself against the door. The creature let out another howl, so loud it seemed to shake the trees, and Jake finally got the door open, scrambling inside and slamming it shut just as the beast reached him. He didn't waste any time. Jake started the engine, floored the gas, and tore out of there, the tires spinning on the gravel as he sped down the dirt road. In the rearview mirror, he caught one last glimpse of the creature standing in the middle of the road, its eyes glowing like fiery embers in the darkness, watching him as he drove away. Jake didn't stop until he was miles away, back on the main road, where the forest was long behind him. His hands were shaking as he gripped the steering wheel, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. He'd always been a man of reason, a man who didn't believe in legends or monsters. But that night in the Ozarks, he'd come face to face with something he couldn't explain at all. He knew he'd never be able to forget those eyes, or the sound of that howl, echoing through the trees. The Ozark Howler was real, and it was out there, probably waiting for the next person to cross its path. And as Jake drove away, he couldn't shake the feeling that, somehow, it had let him go and just move on. That the creature had decided, for reasons he'd never understand, to let him live to tell the tale. It was late October when Jim Peters decided to take a break from his hectic city life and spend a few days at his family's cabin deep in northern Michigan. The cabin, inherited from his grandfather, was situated at the edge of a sprawling forest known for its rustic beauty and, more recently, its strange and creepy legends. Jim had always been intrigued by the local tales, but he never expected to encounter anything out of the ordinary when he was there. The weather was crisp and clear when Jim arrived, and he spent the afternoon preparing the cabin and setting up his outdoor gear. By evening, the forest was winding down, and Jim took a stroll along the wooded trails, savoring the peaceful night. He made a campfire and settled into a chair to enjoy the peace of the wilderness. Around midnight, while the forest was quiet, Jim was sitting by the fire, listening to the sounds of night. It was then that he noticed a peculiar shadow flitting across the sky. At first, it seemed like he had just imagined it, but as he focused, Jim realized it was a large, dark figure. The shape was confusing, a massive winged form that glided effortlessly through the night. Its wings were wide and bat-like, with a span that seemed almost unnatural. The figure had a distinctly humanoid silhouette, with limbs that stretched and contorted as it maneuvered through the air. Its eyes, glowing faintly in the darkness, caught the light of the fire, creating an eerie glow. Jim's curiosity quickly turned to apprehension. He grabbed his flashlight and shone it towards the creature, but it remained hidden, darting in and out of the shadows with an almost deliberate evasiveness. The creature moved silently. Its presence felt more than heard. The air around him seemed to thicken, and Jim felt an odd chill, as if the atmosphere had changed since the creature appeared. He tried to capture the figure with his camera, but the creature's speed and the dim light made it difficult to get a clear shot. Each time Jim adjusted his position, it would change direction, as if aware of his attempts to photograph it. The sight was disconcerting, to say the least, and it made it hard for Jim to focus on anything but the strange being overhead. The creature eventually drifted closer, and Jim could see its features more clearly. It had a tall, slender build with a pair of long, thin legs that ended in sharp, claw-like appendages. Its head was vaguely humanoid but elongated, with deep-set eyes that seemed to pierce through the darkness. The wings, though bat-like, had a shimmering quality that reflected the faintest light, giving them a metallic sheen. Jim noticed that the creature seemed to be circling a specific area of the forest, almost as if it was guarding or searching for something. The patterns of its flight became more predictable, and Jim began to feel that it was trying to communicate, or perhaps even to intimidate him. His unease grew as the creature's presence seemed to influence the environment. The wind picked up, swirling around the clearing with an unnatural force, and the trees creaked and groaned as if in response to its flight. By the time dawn began to break, the creature had vanished. The first light of day revealed a peaceful forest, with no sign of the strange visitor except for the unsettling feeling it left behind. Jim packed up his gear, feeling a mix of relief and lingering apprehension. The experience was surreal, and despite his best efforts to rationalize it, he couldn't shake the feeling that something significant had happened. When he returned to town and recounted his experience to the locals, the response was varied. Some told him it was just forest shadows or a large bird. Others were intrigued, and the story quickly became a topic of conversation. Jim's in-depth descriptions added a layer of intrigue to the tale. In the weeks following his encounter, Jim couldn't escape the sense of unease that had settled over him. He was sure he had seen a Mothman, and the visit had left him completely shaken. His was now filled with a heightened awareness of the shadows and the sounds of the forest. He continued to visit the cabin over the years, never seeing the creature again, but he always stayed vigilant, knowing that it was out there, most likely watching him. It was a clear, crisp morning in late September when Mark Reynolds, a park ranger at Yosemite National Park, began his shift. The park was starting to see fewer visitors as the summer crowds thinned out, leaving the majestic landscape to the dedicated hikers and nature enthusiasts. Mark loved the solitude of this time of year. It gave him a chance to appreciate the park's serene beauty and attend to maintenance tasks with less distraction. As part of his routine, Mark set out to inspect the trailheads and check for any issues along the trails. The early morning sun was just starting to filter through the towering granite cliffs and ancient trees, casting long shadows on the ground. The air was cool and fresh, with a hint of autumn crispness. Mark drove his ranger truck along the winding roads, stopping periodically to check signs and ensure that everything was in order. The vast expanse of Yosemite's wilderness stretched out in every direction, with its iconic landmarks like El Capitan and Half Dome standing proudly against the backdrop of a clear blue sky. Around mid-morning, Mark decided to take a detour to the lesser-traveled Mono Meadow, a picturesque area known for its serene meadows and small pond. The detour was part of his usual checks, but this time, he had an unsettling feeling that something was off. As he arrived at Mono Meadow, he noticed the area was unusually quiet. The typical sounds of birds and rustling leaves were absent, replaced by an eerie stillness that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. Mark parked his truck and got out, his boots crunching on the gravel path as he walked toward the meadow. The meadow was bathed in soft golden light, and the pond at the center was a mirror-like surface reflecting the surrounding trees. Mark began his inspection, noting the state of the trail and looking for any signs of damage or disturbance. As he walked along the edge of the pond, he noticed something strange in the water, ripples spreading outward from a point where nothing seemed to be disturbing the surface. Curiosity piqued, Mark approached the water's edge, scanning the area for any signs of wildlife or disturbances. The ripples continued, but there were no visible animals or objects causing them. The stillness of the meadow was unnerving, and Mark felt a chill despite the relatively mild temperature. Suddenly, Mark saw something out of the corner of his eye. He turned and saw a dark shape moving among the trees on the far side of the meadow. The shape was large and appeared to be moving in a deliberate, slow manner. Mark's instincts kicked in, and he reached for his radio, but the strange silence seemed to interfere with the signal. He decided to investigate, carefully making his way toward the dark shape. As he approached, he noticed it was not an animal, but a figure standing among the trees. The figure was humanoid but seemed distorted, with elongated limbs and a shadowy appearance. Its features were obscured, blending with the darkness of the forest. Mark's heart pounded as he drew closer. The figure was still and silent, its presence both unsettling and mysterious. It had a tall, slender build and seemed to flicker in and out of visibility, as if it were a mirage or an apparition. Mark tried to get a better look, but the figure remained elusive, shifting between the shadows and the light. As he reached the edge of the trees, the figure suddenly turned and began to move away, gliding smoothly through the forest with an unnatural grace. Mark followed cautiously, trying to keep the figure in sight. The forest seemed to close in around him, and the usual sounds of the woods were completely absent. The figure led him deeper into the forest, past familiar landmarks, and into an area Mark had rarely explored. The dense trees and thick underbrush made it difficult to see, and Mark had to use his flashlight to navigate. The figure continued to move ahead, always just out of clear view, its presence haunting and elusive. After what felt like hours, the figure finally stopped and seemed to merge with the shadows. Mark, feeling a mixture of frustration and awe, stood still and tried to take in his surroundings. The forest was quiet, and the figure was gone. The only evidence of its presence was a faint, lingering chill in the air. Mark decided to return to Mono Meadow, his mind racing with the strange encounter. When he reached his truck, he reviewed his notes and checked the area again, but there were no signs of disturbance or any indication of what he had seen. The figure remained an enigma, a shadowy presence that defied explanation. As he drove back to the park headquarters, Mark reflected on the encounter. The figure, with its eerie appearance and elusive nature, left him with a sense of unease and wonder. It was a reminder of the mysteries that could lurk in the vast wilderness of Yosemite, hidden away from the casual observer. Mark chose to keep the experience to himself, sharing it only with a trusted colleague who had a keen interest in the unexplained. The encounter at Mono Meadow remained a personal story, a reminder of the strange and mysterious elements that could surface even in the most familiar places. The figure in the forest, with its haunting presence, was a testament to the wonders and enigmas that the natural world could still hold. In the sweltering heat of a late June afternoon of 2012, Jack McElhenney, a geologist from San Diego, set up camp in the remote stretches of the California desert. He was drawn to this arid landscape by its unique rock formations and mineral deposits, hoping to gather data for his research. His base was a small, isolated clearing near an abandoned mining site, chosen for its seclusion and minimal human interference. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Jack enjoyed the cool desert evening. The sky was a canvas of deep blues and purples, and the stars began to twinkle brightly. He set up his campfire, prepared his equipment for the next day's work, and settled into his tent to read. The silence of the desert was calming, interrupted only by the occasional distant call of a desert creature. Around midnight, Jack's peaceful solitude was shattered by a series of unsettling noises. At first, it sounded like a scuffle or something heavy moving through the brush. Jack, with his natural curiosity piqued, decided to investigate. He grabbed his flashlight and ventured out into the dark, his footsteps crunching softly on the desert floor. Following the sounds, Jack reached a small ridge overlooking a shallow depression in the ground. As he scanned the area with his flashlight, the beam fell upon a strange, otherworldly figure. The creature was unlike anything Jack had ever seen. It stood about 3 to 4 feet tall, with a spiky, reptilian appearance. Its body was covered in rough, grayish skin with an almost scaled texture, and it had a pair of pronounced, spiky ridges running down its back. The creature had large, glowing eyes that reflected the light of Jack's flashlight, giving them an eerie, unsettling quality. Its face was reptilian, with a wide mouth filled with sharp, needle-like teeth. Its limbs were slender but powerful, ending in sharp claws. The creature moved with a swift, jittery gait, and Jack noticed that it had a hunched posture, giving it a somewhat sinister appearance. Jack stood solidly in place, trying to put any type of reality onto what he was witnessing. The creature seemed to be feeding on something in the depression, perhaps an animal carcass or remnants of food. As it fed, it emitted low, grunting and slurping sounds, interspersed with occasional hisses that cut through the stillness of the desert night. Despite the fear gripping him, Jack managed to take a few photographs with his camera. The images, though shaky and poorly lit, captured the creature's distinctive features. He wanted to document this bizarre encounter, even if the photos turned out less than perfect. The creature suddenly stopped feeding and turned its gaze directly at Jack, its eyes reflecting the flashlight's beam, locked onto him with a penetrating stare. The intense gaze made Jack's heart pound. The chupacabra, as he had come to realize, was known in legends for its aggressive behavior and blood-sucking habits, and he was now facing a potential encounter with this cryptid. Feeling a surge of both fear and resolve, Jack slowly backed away from the ridge, not wanting to provoke the creature. He kept his flashlight trained on the chupacabra, watching as it resumed its feeding, seemingly uninterested in his retreat. Once he was safely out of sight, Jack hurried back to his camp, his mind racing with the surreal experience. Back at his campsite, Jack reviewed the photographs, but they only partially captured the creature's strange appearance. Despite the blurry images, Jack knew what he had seen. The encounter had been too vivid and disturbing to be a mere figment of his imagination. The following morning, Jack packed up his gear and left the desert, eager to return to the familiar comforts of home. He kept the encounter to himself, unsure of how to explain it or if others would even believe him. The desert, once a place of peaceful solitude, had become the site of an extraordinary and unsettling experience. Jack's encounter with the chupacabra remained a personal secret, a memory of a strange and frightening night in the California desert. The creature he saw, with its reptilian features and eerie presence, would stay with him as a reminder of the mysteries that lie hidden in the vast, unexplored corners of the world.